Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first podcast. We're here with Professor Brian Robinette from Boston College. I'm Joseph, and the co-host here is Helena. We're based in Dublin, but Brian is joining us from Boston, and we're delighted to have him and talk to him about his new book, which is here. Beautiful looking book cover. It's called The Difference Nothing Makes: Creation, Christ, and Contemplation. And so the idea behind lived experience for everyone is that we talk to the academics themselves and try to delve into their ideas and make them more livable and accessible. And this book is certainly that. And so, Brian, you're very welcome. And we'd like to ask you first, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the origin story of the book itself. I think it came out about a year and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken, and it's already been really well received. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the background of the book?
Sure. Well, thank you both for having me to your podcast, and I wish it all success. I'm
Thank
happy to
you.
be the guinea pig for this, and in any case, it's delightful to be with you both. The origin story of the book is really kind of simple in a way. Several years ago, I had been reading John Caputo's The Weakness of God.
Hmm.
And there were aspects of that book that really tugged at me. I was particularly drawn by his wrestling with the problem of divine agency and power, and was open, at least initially, to what it was that he was doing with some blend between process thought, deconstruction, and some rather eclectic mix of materials and perspectives to give a fresh account of creation, a fresh account that, on the one hand, is trying to affirm some classical understandings of creation, but also wrestling with the problem of evil, wrestling with the problem of the messiness or the chaos of our lived experience, and trying to reconcile
Mhm.
these in these ways that were philosophically, theologically coherent. So I found myself drawn to it, but also very much resisting it because I thought that a number of the criticisms of classical understandings of the theology of creation were a little misplaced or overblown, or there actually might be resources in the tradition in these classical understandings to actually address the concerns that were forefront in him better, that actually might be more coherent. And so this was particularly around the issue of creatio ex nihilo, or creation from nothing. And this has been
Mm.
a sore spot for people who work in the world of philosophical theology, and in particular, who have more process-oriented concerns. For a number of them, including for Caputo, the idea that God creates from nothing is one that foregrounds power, and divine
Mhm.
power in such a way that is largely over and against creaturely agency.
And
And
you're
then it also,
saying, can I interrupt there? Are you saying that's a
yeah,
sore
please.
spot for Caputo?
It is.
Um, Frustrates him for some reason.
It frustrates him because, um, and rightly so, it's part of actually what I found compelling in the book, in his
Mm.
book, was that when we envision God in such a way, it's very easy for that to become appropriated by human beings, such that we operate with certain kinds of understandings of power or agency like God. And so it can provide a certain kind of validation for structures or relations in among human beings that are coercive, as though they were divinely legitimated. So there's a theopolitical element that runs through that text. So I agree essentially with the worry that Caputo had and has about those understandings of God. I just think that the classical understanding of God. And by classical, I mean just classical Christian theology, patristic theology,
Hmm.
more or less received on its own terms. I actually don't think that the criticisms quite apply. And I think that there has been some kind of effort among more modern revisionist approach to the tradition to create certain foils in the tradition that, upon further investigation, historical, theological analysis, don't really stand up. So that was really the genesis of it. I really wanted to get to the issue to say, well, what really is in the biblical, are in the biblical traditions and early Christian theologians around the issue of creatio ex nihilo? How did this doctrine really come about? What was at stake for the theologians who came to a pretty strong consensus within a short period of time, relatively speaking, that God creates from nothing, that there is no prior condition or limitation upon
Hmm.
God and upon God's creative act. What was really at stake for them, and how did they attempt to articulate those views in a coherent way? So I
For
wrote an article. Yes, please.
well, just to jump in and for the sake of our audience, and I'll let Helena jump in a moment. Um, what is what is at stake? If I'm not mistaken, creation from nothing was the first major doctrine that the church came to a consensus on very early. Um, I don't know if you know why that is, or why that specific doctrine, say other than, I don't know, the Trinity or the Incarnation or dozens of other doctrines, the sacraments, priesthood. For our listeners, I think some of us, including me, might be surprised why the doctrine of creation is at the forefront of a fledgling small church in the early to mid 100s, almost 2,000 years ago. Why are they debating about creation and specifically creation from nothing?
Mhm. Well, I think there are two main reasons, actually. One of them had to do with the more proximate circumstances of a philosophical articulation of creation, broadly
Hmm.
philosophical, that maintained the divine principle as originating creation out of some pre-existent matter, some pre-existent formlessness, a potentiality that is essentially co-eternal with the divine principle. So the the essentially from a kind of Middle Platonism, a sort of an understanding of creation as emergent from chaotic elements or sort of pure potentiality that is from time immemorial, put it that way, that there's no real beginning to it. And I think that for Christian theologians, this seemed quite at odds with the biblical accounts from Genesis. We also see certain accounts in Isaiah, certain accounts in the Psalms, and then particularly when you look at, for instance, the Gospel of John and the poetic prologue to the Gospel of John, where creation comes. There's no language from nothing, but the language really is from the Logos. Creation comes from the Logos, and there's nothing else presupposing. So that was one thing. In other words, that this view, sort of in a kind of popular philosophical assumptions about the world, seemed quite at odds with biblical accounts. And so once that was presented as a question, then it prompted Christian theologians to articulate an alternative to it. And the language of from nothing was not meant to assert a kind of substance or a formless substance called nothing. It just really means it's a pure negation to say that there is nothing that is presupposed in God's creative act, that it comes from God's freedom and from the overflow of divine freedom and love and nothing else. So that was one thing. But the second thing was had something to do with the character of creation itself. There were certain views that had it that creation or the created order has something so fundamentally broken about it, that evil, what we experience as evil, is really somehow related to the material creation. And so Christian theologians, obviously informed by the biblical traditions, and not least a robust theology of the incarnation, wanted to affirm that creation is primordially good. Dualistic understandings of creation, that somehow matter is something like the seedbed of evil. So that was the twofold character of the affirmation, about divine freedom on the one hand and agency, and then on the other hand, an issue about evil, where it comes from, or
I
where it
know
doesn't.
Helene. Yeah, thanks, Brent. I
Thanks.
know Helena wants to jump in. She's quite keen on process theology. And there are other
Mhm.
podcasts out there that prioritize and privilege that framework. And John
Mhm.
Caputo and Catherine Keller and others, they reject all of that idea of
Mhm.
creation from nothing. And it really is the first part of it's sort of the first leg of your book. And you outline a lot of that beautifully, if I can put a plug in for your book there. And so, Helena, I mean, not that we want to enter into a debate, that's not the point of the podcast, but Helena, I don't know if you want to tease out further what's at stake. There's kind of two camps. You subscribe to and hold to the doctrine of creation from nothing, or you don't.
Yeah, the first thing I suppose, Brian, I'd like to say is your book is absolutely wonderful, and it really has opened my own eyes and my own thinking in terms of this doctrine. In particular, the practical element to this in terms of contemplation, because traditionally we would have grown up with the doctrine as how and why the world began. But to bring this into conversation and to frame it within this kind of contemplative way has been really great, So thank you for that. It is interesting that you bring John Caputo into the conversation as a kind of an antagonist, at the outset, and that idea of strong and weak theology. For me, weak was always good. A weak theology. I have just to maybe even just for some of the listeners, Joseph Bessler has a great book on looking at crediting rhetoric in the Theopoetics of John Caputo, and to even look at that idea of strong versus weak.
Can you show us that book?
Sure.
Just show us the being moved by moving words, okay?
So strong theology is official power, authority. Weak theology is the force of persuasion. Strong theology is law. Weak theology is justice. Strong theology is dogmas and declarations. Weak theology is narrative, poetic language. Strong theology is theologic. Weak theology is theopoetic. Just to give an idea. So it's interesting to use that kind of dichotomy of weak and strong, because creation ex nihilo would always, according to Caputo, would be a strong theology, so therefore should be abandoned, So I really like that kind of way that you kind of explore the misleading aspect to that, which I think was great. I suppose another, just to maybe ask a question, Catherine Keller as well has written an entire book on, against this doctrine of creation ex nihilo in favor of creation ex profundus. So creation out of the deep, a calling forth, not an opposing form, but producing from nothing, but a relational activity. I suppose I'm wondering, just because I use a lot of Catherine Keller in my own PhD work, in my research, is it possible to hold together, the meaning of ex nihilo and ex profundus, not in competition? Does God's transcendence, is it at odds with God's nearness? Can they be held in close unity?
Yes, your question really is was one of mine leading into it. On the one hand, I agreed with these critiques of certain kinds of strong theologies. I have a certain kind of aversion to them, like by disposition, sort of allergic to accounts of God that foreground power that has anything to do with coercion or instrumentalizing of fear. I would like to smash those images of God, to be quite
Right.
frank. So, so I have so much in sympathy, I think, with what is affectively and theologically motivating those critiques. Where I differ with them is what role certain doctrines play. For instance, what role certain aspects of the tradition play and the implications of that. I got a little worried, I think, by the dichotomization. Now, here are strong theologies and here are weak theologies, doctrines, experience. You kind of see this in a set of columns. And I thought that it was a bit ironic in a way that in the effort to try to overcome binaries, that these were being, in a sense, reinscribed. And I thought that the rhetoric, I'm quite good with rhetoric being not merely a cosmetic to theology, but really substantive to what theology is and can be. But I thought that the rhetoric was actually getting out of hand and not being sufficiently accountable to, I think, better, more charitable readings of the tradition. And as a matter of fact, and it's not because I have to have the tradition as though by default, it can't be challenged by any means. I just think that a lot of the resources of misappropriations of those traditions can be found within those traditions. So that was really, as I say, part of the genesis of the book. But Helena, you're also right to mention something about the practical dimensions of it, because I found. So I have, maybe we can talk about this as the conversation goes on, but I have been someone I've been drawn to the contemplative traditions of Christianity, and not just Christianity, but certainly Christianity, for a long time. And I consider contemplative practice actually to be integral to the craft of theology. So I don't think of it as merely something people might do privately, but should be something that is threaded through the activity of doing theology, including in forms involving a written page. And one of the things that was so striking to me about the investigation into the origins of creatio ex nihilo and its various implications was the contemplative dimension of that doctrine. And by that I mean something like this, that we can be utterly astonished by the fact that there is anything at all rather than nothing, that all of this exists. You exist, I exist, this world exists, we are conscious, we are subject to the world, we are also actors in the world. But if for a moment you can interrupt the habit of the thinking mind, which predicts experience or produces various representations of our experience, and become open to the freshness of that which is, the sheer gratuity of it. If it doesn't strike terror in you to sort of suddenly be wakeful that you're in the midst of this, it might produce a profound sense of gratitude, in any case, wonderment. And it seemed to me that the affirmation of creation from nothing, this curious phrase, from God and from the sheer suchness of God, without any kind of ulterior motive, without any sort of reason, is a contemplative insight. And you could run through a whole host of Zen koans and not find Something as arresting as the phrase creation from nothing. To dwell with that really does invite, I think, a meditative or a contemplative disposition. And so this is related to other aspects of the book. There are a lot of other things going on in the book, but one of them running throughout is the contemplative dimension and what really it means to be a theologian who is in a state of wonderment about his or her existence and the existences of others and the wildness of this existence, but also its beauty and its harmony, its simple suchness. That is itself a contemplative act, and I think it's a theological act.
Can I ask as well, like, is that, do you see, because you do outline that this doctrine, it is, hope is part of, it's a hope for creation. And do you relate this to hope? I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently and, that the way you kind of frame this, that the fact that anything exists at all rather than nothing and the sense of wonder that arises in this recognition, that idea of letting it in, it's never ending. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about the invitational sense of this. It's, creation ex nihilo isn't a single event. It's an ongoing process. This kind of continual idea is really powerful. And I suppose that podcast that I heard recently, it said that hope is almost something that there's a growing number of people in the world that are quite suspicious of hope. It's something almost we're allergic to in this world today. And, obviously to me, that's, hope is something integral to my life and to my faith. But, how do you kind of define hope, and how do you relate hope to all of that, what you're saying about this sense of wonder and the sense of just the awe of it all?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think if I could sum up what I take hope to be in a Christian tradition and what are its most reliable sources, there would be two. The first is this contemplative dimension, and I'll try to explain. But I think what one source of hope for me is what happens when I can, in prayer and contemplative prayer more specifically, allow myself and allow all that preoccupies me to completely unravel, to just simply be let go of without any need to manage it, without any need to repress it, to attach to it. What happens when you abandon all of your aims, all of your expectations, even your hopes and what you can imagine is worth hoping for, and allow yourself just to completely surrender? What is there? Is there anything that can be trusted? And I think that what contemplative practice slowly reveals, sometimes it can be very sudden, but I think it's more of a seasoning and a process of unfolding, is that in fact there is that which is utterly trustworthy, utterly good, utterly simple and beneficent, that holds us in being, without which nothing would exist. And so that in the midst of utter chaos, or what would seem to be a matter of hopelessness, there is that which we can depend upon and trust as good. So to me, that is actually a source of hope. When what it is that I might hope for in the way that I could imagine it is itself completely let go of expectations, agenda, and allowing myself to be held in being by that which is utterly beneficent.
Yeah, and that's liberating. And I have to say, without getting too personal, I mean, relationships can be full of what you say, chaos or conflict. And I was literally reading your book a couple of years ago when it first came out. And I was having a moment with someone, and I was reading on your encouragement to let go and to release myself from conflict and rivalry. And it really genuinely was therapy. It helped. I did let go, and it was so liberating. And I'd like to move into what our listeners are probably interested in ultimately is some of the practical consequences of your book, of the doctrine. What I found so therapeutic and fulfilling personally, there is something of a kind of therapy or sermon-like quality to your work. And I mean that in the best way.
Yeah.
I found it meeting needs. I found myself learning how to be more contemplative and just be more like a witness to what's happening rather than trying to be so interested in grasping and controlling my environment. But what I did notice, and I'll be quiet in a minute, I'm kind of rambling, is that your part one is about not only creation coming from nothing, but it's also about the nature of God, this picture we have of God. And I'll bring my parents in. Sorry, mom and dad, if you're listening. They love the Bible. They're relatively conservative, evangelical American Christians, and they would be deeply offended if I said God is weak. They want a powerful, strong God, the God of Job, the God of the Psalms, and probably there's a lot of traditional pictures and metaphors of God as powerful. You're proposing God is vulnerable, God as a God of love and weakness, and then you root that in the person of Jesus of Nazareth in part two of your book. And you want us to see that the nature of God as weak in the best way, as one who doesn't get attached or isn't caught up in conflict and rivalry, as a God who is open to forgiveness and love and hospitality. You unfold all of that and you call it a strange victory. Not just a victory, but a strange one. I wonder if you can speak into that. I mean, this is going to open up the whole theoretical field of mimetic desire and rivalry, which is really important to all of your work and what I love so much about your work. And then we can talk more about contemplation and whether God can be thoughts and how to experience and undergo contemplative practice. But can you tell us a little bit more about the strangeness of the victory of Jesus?
Happily. So that's really the second part of what grounds my sense of hope. In a sense, coming back to Helena's question. So there was the ground of hope, if you want to put it that way, more protologically understood with what it is that I had indicated about this letting go and what happens when we do that, and why that is actually a hopeful practice, even when we let go of what we imagine hope being. But the other one is more Christological, the other one. And so it's directly also related to your question, Joe. So to me, the reason why this is a Christian theology and not just a generally theistic one, or one that might share some family resemblances with other contemplative traditions that could be non-theistic for that matter, is the Christological core of it. And so, the way that I envisioned the book is that it's sort of in a trifold, sort of a triptych. You have part one and part three, but in the middle is really Christological, and it's meant to do that. It's meant to kind of focus the narrative threads and the arguments and the rhetorical features of it. But for me, as a Christian theologian, I'm very interested in what does God and God's beneficence, God's agency as weak, or however we might think of that, actually show up in this world and in a life. And here I think some willingness to be somewhat playfully paradoxical about the language of weakness and strength needs to be, invoked. I mean, Paul does this, of course, in terms of strength and weakness. The fact is that Jesus of Nazareth, just to speak of his historical ministry, it would not be considered weak by a lot of understandings of that word. Somebody who is weak, somebody who is, let's say, a doormat to
Yeah.
injustice, is probably not going to get crucified as a blasphemer and enemy of the state. There's something that's so provocative about what Jesus is doing, something so relentlessly troubling, in a sense, divisive and polarizing, I think we'd have to say, such that he could arouse such suspicion and animus to be hounded, to be suspected, and to be tried and ultimately crucified in such grotesque and public fashion as a form of state-sponsored terrorism, if you want to put it that way. So if we say that God is somehow weak, what does it mean? What does that weakness actually look like in something like the life of Jesus? Well, it's weak in light of certain kinds of understandings of power. What Jesus isn't is violent or coercive or manipulative or overpowering. And so when we think of strong or powerful, we tend to think as overcoming by way of coercion, as though here you have an obstacle and then here you have an agent, and the agent is overcoming the obstacle because it has more force. Jesus is not force, or the power of God manifest in Jesus is not force in that way. And yet it is hugely disruptive. And, I tend to think of Jesus's ministry as a relentless agitation in the pressure points of human conflict. It's not as though Jesus is trying to generate conflict for its sake. It's that he is trying to unbind conflict. But the way in which he's doing that is not going to leave those in conflict, especially those who have an interest in maintaining conflict, very happy. And so he makes himself vulnerable to reprisal or to some kind of reactivity from the powers that be. So I think it's helpful when you just sort of look at Jesus's ministry. I mean, of course, I'm interested in the death and the resurrection. I've written extensively on the resurrection, I think, as you know. But I was particularly interested in that section of the book, working with Scripture pretty closely, of course, but also drawing upon some of the work by Rene Girard and some of the most significant theologians who have appropriated his work in this field called mimetic theory, to try to understand.
Can you lay that out for us a little bit?
I will.
Yeah.
To try to understand something about the nature of human desire and mimetic rivalry, and to see how Jesus is implicated in that and is really trying to release us from mimetic rivalry. I'll say something briefly about that for your listeners. I've mentioned the name Rene Girard. Some may know of him, others may not. But Girard was a thinker, French, but spent most of his time in the United States and at Stanford studying literature, cultural anthropology, theology, philosophy, psychology, evolutionary sciences, etc., but had an account of the nature of desire as mimetic, meaning that we imitate one another. Human beings desire according to the desire of others. We learn what to pursue, what to love, what to seek after, or what to avoid through incorporating the desires of others. And because of this, we find ourselves as a species intensely cooperative, that we can share desires with one another and know each other's intentions and engage in coordinated activity that is able to produce things like, cities, for instance, or put people on the moon. Or
Yeah.
on the other hand, because we share desires and we're so interwoven in how we desire, that when we desire something, we can often find ourselves in conflict with others who desire similarly. And Girard has this, I think, brilliant account of the origins of most of human conflict as rooted in this convergent desire between two or more persons upon various objects. These objects can be symbolic, of course, be about values and not just physical objects. And that's why we get into conflict and polarize, etc. That's one feature of Girard's work. And then another feature is his account of how human beings cope with our tendency towards conflict by creating strong in-groups versus out-groups and projecting upon out-groups or particular persons inside one's in-group with sort of a liminal figure who is ousted or scapegoated and who is regarded as the source of the contamination or the conflict within the group. And so that person is expelled, is sacrificed, is lynched, is crucified in order to try to maintain some in-group solidarity. And I think that when you read the Gospels in light of these dynamics of human desire, suddenly a lot of its features just simply leap off the page. It's like you've seen these Gospels or read these Gospels many times, but it gives you almost like an IMAX theater version of
Hmm.
it. And that's really what I tried to do in the middle of the book, which is to apply this not rigidly. And I'm not necessarily a card-carrying member of sort of a Girardian understanding of all reality. I go very far with him, but I'm still critical. But that afforded, I think, me an opportunity to try to understand the dynamics of weakness and power and to see how Jesus is actually exercising agency in a very powerful way, but in a way that is not mimetically entangled with the powers that be. And so there's a subversive way in which Jesus operates.
Can I intervene here and just ask, would that be, I mean, you've written a lot on Girard in your first book, in this book, in articles. Um, and so I want to just pull this out a little bit more. Would would saying rivalry is bad and we need to let go of rivalry, even though we have every natural instinct to enter into rivalry, doesn't matter what kind of rivalry. It could be a rivalry between two people at work or sports teams fans, or just you can think of any rivalry situation between countries, between political parties, and that rivalry plagues us as a species, and that one of the main breakthroughs of the ministry of Jesus is to say, just let go of the rivalry. But I would also say why that's so powerful is we can't help but imitate each other. And I think
Mhm.
if that makes sense, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And that imitation is good as well. We use imitation to learn language through copying. If you ever look at a baby, they have all these mirroring neurons and all these instincts to imitate. When you smile at the baby, it smiles back and it constantly imitates words to learn how to speak. And we imitate social conventions. You know, when I speak to someone, I don't get right in their face like this. But I've learned
Mhm.
over time that's rude. I need to give people, 18 inches to 2 feet. But all of this is very instinctive. And I'm not even conscious of the fact that I'm imitating. I remember once being in college with a roommate, and we were watching a baseball game or something, and he got up and got some pretzels. And I just remember very consciously, and I had no idea who Rene Girard was or what even the word mimetic meant at the time. I went over and I looked at him eating pretzels and I thought, I want pretzels now.
Mhm.
It was that basic. And I remember thinking back when I was reading Girard later in life that that sort of helps make sense of these basic instincts we all have when we see the world around us. We often take it in and we copy,
Mhm.
and we don't even realize we're doing it. And so
Yeah.
is part of that's a really long-winded way to say is part of the ministry of Jesus. Like if we sit down and read the New Testament and we read it in that light, is it to help us get conscious of the fact that we imitate so much and that we need to be careful how we do practice? Can I get control over my imitation impulses, or do they control me?
So, great question. I think that you're right to insist on the goodness of imitation, of mimetic desire. This is something that some readers of Girard wonder about. They wonder because he can be so insistent and penetratingly so about the negative consequences of imitation. One wonders whether imitation or mimetic desire is something to be gotten rid of, somehow transcended,
Yeah,
or are we fated, for conflict? And that's not the case. It's not the case in Girard's work. I think that maybe he's been a little bit one-sided in terms of his analyses, but the fact is that imitation is good, even if it's also ambiguous. I mean, it's good for all the reasons you say. You learn how to walk, gestures, language, the transmission of skills that are appropriate and good for living are learned um, through imitation. And so we are inducted into sociality essentially through imitation. Without it, we wouldn't have all of this. And because it's so basic, it usually lies in the background of our experience. It's pre-conscious. It's
yeah,
something that we find ourselves doing without knowing that we're doing. Sometimes we are made aware of it. When you're younger, it's it's generally more acceptable to imitate other people, but then when we get older, we get a little bit ashamed about it. We try to we might want to submerge our tendency to be preoccupied with what other people are doing. And we might dissimulate about that. It might be a source of embarrassment. No, I don't imitate so and so. I'm my
yeah,
own
yeah,
person. But the fact is that we're constantly doing this. Um, in the Gospels, Jesus says some version of "follow me" over 80 times. It's fundamental to discipleship to follow Christ. Now, even though he's not using the word mimetic desire, it's clear that the nature of discipleship, the core of discipleship, is imitating Christ. Imitatio Christi, as we say, the imitation of Christ or the imitation of God. You think of also Paul's letters. Sometimes he'll refer to himself as one to be imitated because he imitates
yeah,
Christ. So discipleship is really about a kind of chain or a network of imitation that has Christ as the model for desire. In Girard's language, there is mimetic desire, there is the one who desires, and then there's the model. The model could be another person, it could be other persons. It can also be more diffused in terms of certain kinds of culturally generated images that we might want to imitate. And of course, when we desire or when we are just being human, we are modeling desires for others. It's something unavoidable. So we are both subject to a model of desire while also modeling desires to others, and sometimes in reciprocal fashion. The Gospels propose a way of life that has to do with a mode of desiring. So it's not about not desiring. It's about how desire and who you're desiring, uh, who is modeling the desire. So that I think is the key. And of course, the for Girard, I think where what he sees in the Gospels is this very artful way in which Jesus is calling disciples unto himself, but also, of course, unto the reign of God, where Jesus is not a rival to them, is not an obstacle to them in the sense of competing with them for certain kinds of goods. There's a way in which Jesus is modeling desire that is that makes him transparent in a way. So imitating Christ is the safe way of modeling
Mhm.
desire in another human person, because Christ's, you could say, kenotic openness is openness to God, God the Father. There's a pacific, I use that phrase quite a lot. I also borrow it from James Allison, but a pacific desire, you could call it an eschatological desire that we can be trained into insofar as we desire according to the desires of Jesus.
In the middle of your book, I'll let Helena jump in here. Um, and I think we'll maybe go 10 or 15 more minutes, Brian, but this is
Sure.
great. Um, you talk about how we treat others, kind of at the end of your really lucid explanation. For our listeners, if you want to really sink your teeth into Girard, read part two. Towards the end, you start talking about, and this is for any, a lot of world religions. You can think of Buddhism, you can think of other mystical traditions. So it's more about, I think, and Brian can come back to me on this. It's more about a kind of letting be, a patience of letting others give themselves without feeling like we're in competition all the time. I mean, it is a real strong impulse in my kids, who are very honest, at displaying mimetic desire, to be one-upping their friends or to be in competition.
Mhm.
Excuse me. It's probably a strong desire, I presume, in all of us, and that one wonders if the origin of world religions is to help us find skills to get conscious of that and restrain that,
Mhm.
and chill out, just let go and release, and stop acting like I need to be everybody's competitor, which is so countercultural. I'm watching the NBA playoffs. I love American sports.
Mhm.
What we want in a champion is someone who is hyper competitive, someone who will win at all costs. And so this is kind of inverting that. And you
Mhm.
say at the very end of part two that when we want to know our neighbor or our friend or an acquaintance, a work colleague, that we need to unknow them. We need to relinquish our preconceptions. And I'll just read you a quote. It's really good here, articulate. You say, I may release him or her from my preconceptions, from my convenient labels, from my overriding schemes, from my need to manage and defend myself, other perceptions. And so, what you're saying is the humility of which lots of world religious leaders speak of is really about the holy mystery of the neighbor, this other who calls me to a certain way of attending and loving. And then you go on to say, when you find yourself judging another person, okay, simply let the judgment become a reminder to return to silence, to an awareness that there is a deeper, that silence is deeper than any limiting thought or emotional reaction you may be having. Let
Mhm.
that flow through you and look over the shoulder of the thought or the feeling and just observe it.
Mhm.
And you say this will help combat that temptation to be a competitor, to be judgy, to indulge in preconceptions and stereotypes. And I suppose that is the real gift of your work, but it's also the most urgent part is how do we learn to let go of
Mhm.
preconceptions? I mean, it's just probably like anything, plain old practice and getting
Yeah.
mindful of it, you know?
Yeah. Couple things that, thank you for that. I think um, to acknowledge a couple of phrases that appear in that quote. One is from the Cloud of Unknowing, the anonymous 14th century Middle English treatise on contemplative prayer, The Cloud of Unknowing, where the author is instructing the reader into the path of contemplative prayer. And really what is precipitating that specific instruction is the the easily observable phenomenon that when we sit in silence, we will notice that our thoughts are churning, that there's just this constant flow of ideational content, and ideational content that's suffused with emotive elements. All of this is happening in us willy-nilly. And what the author is saying is that when we enter into silence, if you find yourself feeling besieged by certain kinds of thoughts, don't try to extinguish them. Don't fight them. You're not trying to eliminate them, but neither are you indulging them by attaching them and sort of putting your, kind of getting a grip on them and fantasizing through them. We're doing that all the time. Like, the screen of consciousness, if you could see it, we're just sort of like constantly preoccupied with projective phenomena, receptive projective phenomena that often can sometimes reveal the world to us, but often occlude it or distort it. And so a contemplative practice is one that allows the practitioner to become increasingly aware of that fact. That is happening all the time. And so rather than wrestle with it or get frustrated with it, it's such a subtle instruction. It's beautiful. Just simply look over its shoulder. It's this brilliant instruction that's so
Really
obvious,
like that.
so obviously experienced of what it is like to become conscious of the fact that we are projecting all the time and not indulging in that projection, but looking over its shoulder, which amounts to, in a sense, seeing through thought, or the ideational, emotive content that's constantly coursing through consciousness. This gives us the capacity, I think, to be more receptive to people as they are, rather than merely as we are projecting them to be, according to our labels, according to our agendas, according to our hurts or our, desires. What is a practice that's appropriate to allowing the other person to be him or herself such as they are, and not merely according to what I imagine them to be? This is similar. Actually, I don't know that it's really all that different from the contemplative prayer with God. Allowing God to be not merely according to what I want or need God to be, but as God is.
That's a really good
So a
point.
certain kind of rehearsal in contemplative practice, or the cloud of unknowing, letting go of schemas, designs, etc., allowing to be what is, trusting in the insights and the wisdom of that and the spacious quality that really opens up in one's experience. That is directly related to a way of becoming more attitudinally open to other people in their mystery, in their inviolable dignity, as it turns out, and in your own. Because I think that so many of us are saddled. That's maybe an anemic way to put it. Burdened, crushed by a lot of thoughts about ourselves that we generate or have been imposed upon us by other people who are close to us or by our society, that we imagine that that's actually who and what we are. And this is, I think, if not among the greatest sources of suffering in human experience. And so contemplative practice isn't about so much I don't know, having pleasant feelings or taking a break, but it's actually an inquiry into the very nature of our consciousness, the nature of our experience, so as to find, hopefully, progressively resources for becoming free from the mechanisms and the projections that produce suffering, and not just on an interpersonal basis, but socially, and the way in which social activities and relations and projections become sedimented in institutions and
Yeah.
history.
Yeah, I'll let Helena jump in. I was going to say I would like to hear that from a popular book you'd write on that. That would be that's project, a future project. But also, what do we do? We don't have to answer this now, but it's just an immediate response that comes to mind, that I imagine it comes to mind for a lot of folks of a certain disposition who are genuinely kind, patient, and when we encounter somebody who might be abusive or manipulative or hurting us, what kind of
Yeah,
boundaries do we enforce? That has to be part of the conversation too. But
definitely.
I don't want to necessarily go down that road, but part of like being present in the moment. And I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book on happiness. He's a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist who died recently and wrote several popular books in the West. And there's real connections with Buddhism here about just letting go a little bit and being patient. And you're right, it is so interesting to look at how often I, just me, little old Joe, project constantly my anxieties and my insecurities and my worries onto not just people, but my computer, my books, my chair, my phone. I just walk around coloring my whole environment.
Mhm.
And if I could just chill out, I suppose there's probably a reason for, the mass industry of medication, but there's probably reasons that medication is so common, and it probably assists in that. I'm going to let Helena jump in here now
No,
before I.
I was going to just thank you, Brian, because I were kind of conscious of your own time, and thank you for being with us. But what's next are you working on? Are you going to stay here? Are you going to develop in a new direction, or just curious to know?
Well, Joe, you may, I guess, I telegraphed this to you, but this is actually my next book project, namely
Oh, is it
to,
really? Go ahead. I
yeah.
didn't know that. Go ahead.
So, the book is at least tentatively entitled "Letting Creation Happen,"
Nice.
and then the subtitle, I think, at least at this point, is an experiment in mystical theology. And um, the the purpose of the book is to give an account of a contemplative itinerary that is more accessible for people who may, of course, have a background in theology as academics, but who may not. So I have in mind, of course, people like the two of you, but also, family members like my father. Could I write this
Mhm.
in a way that my dad could pick up and
Yeah.
enjoy and benefit from, or my sons, or my undergraduates who are not, let's say, theology majors or minors, but who may have some interest in something like that. I think that it's a tragedy, as it, not that I'm the one to fix it, or that I imagine myself as even part of other people who are trying to fix it, but I do think it's a tragedy that the Christian tradition has such a wealth of spiritual itineraries and figures and practices, but that these are so little known by Christians today. It's very rare, I think, for a typical Christian to learn about or to hear, let's say, in a pulpit, about the great mystics and contemplatives of the tradition. And yet they hunger for spirituality and the quite understandable sociologically speaking, the I'm spiritual but not religious phenomenon, um, that that Christian faith and the churches have not really done a very good job
Mm.
of providing these resources. And so often is the case that a person, I experienced this myself in the 20s, where I imagined that in order to engage in a serious spiritual discipline, something like meditation, that was to be had outside of the Christian context. And this is not at all to underplay the enormous value of interreligious dialogue. There's something to learn from other religious traditions that are not just simply duplicated in the Christian tradition. So, but there are massive resources that are within the Christian tradition that are just simply not known. And so I tend to think of the one of the goals of the text is just simply to be part of an effort of making this more known, and not just merely as referring to, say, past figures, though in company with them, but also as a kind of constructive proposal of what it might be like to undertake these kinds of practices in light of, for instance, basic affectivity or emotion or desire or thought patterns or the life of the mind, the intellect, the sort of progressive unfolding of spiritual practices and a contemplative idiom that are meant to be an encouragement to others. So that's the idea of the next project.
Would you consider it something like therapy? Could I put it as simply as that? Would it be a therapeutic instead of sitting in front of a psycho a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist? Could we also just tap into or complement that with spiritual practices, mystical traditions, and see it as a way to improve our mental health?
I would love that to be the case. When you use
Hmm.
the word therapy, obviously there's a certain kind of trivial understanding of that word, which is not what you mean. And there's a deeper sense of that word. I'm thinking of um, Martha Nussbaum's book, The Therapy of Desire,
Desire, yeah, great book. Hmm.
sense where she looks at ancient philosophical systems as being therapeutic in the sense of working with the dynamics of desire in order to open persons up to genuine and enduring happiness, flourishing, essentially, a strong sense of that term, happiness, is deep joy.
Hmm.
In that sense, definitely, I think that is the case. A therapy of desire in the sense of trying to understand and using certain kinds of theoretical understandings to get a better grip on the nature of desire, but also not um, being content with that, but working through a kind of program, as it were, of practices that can build or on top of one another or interlock with one another and are adaptable. Hence the business about experiment, an experiment in mystical theology or experiment in Christian mysticism, that are meant to be appropriated and adjusted according to persons' needs and seasons of life.
Yeah, I think Pierre Hadot's book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, and Martha Nussbaum's book, Therapy of Desire, they both tap into Stoicism and Epicureanism. And those are increasingly popular if you just walk into a bookshop, your local bookshop. And there's no reason why Christian therapeutic resources and therapies can't also be used alongside of those. I feel like the market is cornered by Stoicism and Buddhism and Epicureanism. So I'd be really interested to read that work. Helena, do you have any other final questions or thoughts or concerns, additions, subtractions?
Well, maybe just to share
Objections?
objection.
Lots of them. Yeah.
I'd love to share just my favorite. It's maybe a nice way to end our conversation today. And apologies if I'm paraphrasing, but the book, as we know, it's the difference nothing makes, and apologies, I don't know what page it's on. I should have written it down, but what you have said is that, and what I particularly like is that the Christian faith offers a path for envisioning and living into this dynamic relation between God and world, and God gives God's self away in order that we might become. So for me, that's, the human fully alive, to become fully human. And we respond to God openly. We grow in God as God has self-communicated in the two moments or phases that you spoke about, the incarnation, creation. It's the one process of God's self-giving and self-expression. And this is why we were made and why we have come to be. And this is the difference nothing makes. That's really powerful, and just to say thank you for writing this. And it's just a really wonderful book. And just thanks for joining us today, Brian.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful summary. I couldn't have done it any better, and I'm really appreciative. I sense the sincerity of that, and feel encouraged by what it is that you've said and the questions that you've asked and the way that you've responded. So I'm wishing you both the best, and of course this podcast. I'm very excited for you, and best to you in future conversations that you'll have.